Many Latter-day Saints have heard of the Hawn's Mill Massacre, but for those who haven't, what was it?
The Hawn's Mill Massacre was an attack on a group of Latter-day Saints who had settled along a creek in Missouri in the 1830s. And in addition to the settlers who were there, a group of Latter-day Saints from Kirtland had also arrived there and were just camping there in tents. There were 17 men and boys who were killed in the massacre, and about another 15 men, women, and children who were wounded. When the Missourians had attacked the community, the Latter-day Saints had tried to surrender, but they had been pushed back immediately. And the men who had planned, if they needed to go into the blacksmith shop to protect the community, did so. But the blacksmith shop turned out to just be a trap for them. And so most of the men who had sought refuge there, where the few weapons in the community were hidden, were killed. The massacre took the lives of an elderly man as well as children, and those deaths of children were not accidental. They were shot execution style.
And this was part of a larger series of conflicts in Missouri, correct?
That's right. This is a story of the old-time Missouri settlers in conflict with the newcomer Latter-day Saints. And there were many points and issues which they had conflict over, and that conflict escalated until it erupted in violent episodes, one after another, each one retaliating for the last one. So this particular instance was a retaliation for some attacks Latter-day Saint militiamen had made on other settlements in nearby Daviess County. The thing we have to remember about Hawn's Mill is none of the people who were at Hawn's Mill had actually participated in that previous attack.
So this was completely unprovoked.
This was completely unprovoked, and the people who were settled right here were all absolutely innocent in the previous violence.
So with all these other acts of violence, why do you think this story of this massacre has become part of the common narrative and history of the church?
I think the Hawn's Mill Massacre has become so symbolic and has really stayed in the memory of Latter-day Saints because it was such a brutal attack and because women and children were targeted as well as just men. There was no battle of equal forces here. This was very much a slaughter, and it was an attack against people's homes. And so homes were ransacked, their belongings were stolen, their horses were stolen. I think also the fact that everyone there was innocent really makes this a story which says, this is what happened to us in Missouri.
Do you think this attack could have been avoided?
Well, for historians looking back, it's easy with the advantage of hindsight to say, oh yes, this instance could have been avoided, but that's a very simplistic answer to a very difficult situation. Certainly the people who were there, I think, probably asked themselves that question. Those who were the victims of the massacre, could we have avoided this? And I think that Joseph Smith probably thought about that question as well, because on a couple of instances in Nauvoo, he gave sermons in which he used the Hawn's Mill Massacre as an example. He had, weeks before the massacre, he had given counsel for people who were living out in the rural areas to move into the cities where they could be protected. The people at Hawn's Mill may have felt that they were a large enough settlement that they could have protected themselves there and that they would be safe. But in Nauvoo, he said, if they had only followed my counsel, they wouldn't have been killed.
Some people have used Joseph's words in Nauvoo as an example of this story as straight obedience and disobedience, that when you're obedient, you are protected, and when you're disobedient, you can be harmed. It seems that it's a little bit more complicated than that.
Well, it is more complicated than that. We have used that story a lot over many generations as a cautionary tale because, of course, it's good to be obedient, and we are often blessed for that. We have to remember that even when we do follow counsel, not all of us are always protected because bad things can still happen to us. So it's not quite as black and white as sometimes we like to pretend. I think we have to be careful in this case, too, not to blame the victims here. They had very complex decisions to make. If they had picked up and left and gone to Far West, there were dangers on that road as well. These are not easy decisions to make. We're not in their shoes, and we can't know all the answers to the questions that they were facing.
So, what lessons do you think we can learn from this massacre?
As you read the accounts of the people who survived the massacre, what you see is incredible faith and courage. One of those victims, Amanda Barnes Smith, lost her husband, one of her sons, and her other son was very seriously wounded. And as she wrote about that later, she wrote about burying her husband and son, and as well as the other victims, and said, "We trusted their bodies to God, that He would take care of them. And we knew He would take care of us too." So I think that's an incredible strain of faith that runs through all of those accounts. I think the other lesson that Latter-day Saints can draw from this instance is that we should have great empathy for the oppressed, for those who've been brutalized, those who've been persecuted, those who've been beaten down in this world, because that story was once our story.